you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure for me to be here and to give these two lectures in Tomsk. As you know, it's my first time in Russia. Now already it's the fourth day, and my impression is very positive. And and I'm now looking forward to give these two talks to you, and I hope that I'm able to make myself understand. Sorry, so I have to switch on this, otherwise it gets lost. Might be parts of the lecture might be a little bit abstract, but I also prepared a lot of images, and just like this, I also the important issues, the important points you can read on the screen, so it might help you to follow the lecture. So first of all, in my two lectures, I will address the topic of communication, particularly social communication in semiotics in the field of the material world. So it's not theoretical semiotics, it's applied semiotics. It will, though, focus on the field, of course, of architecture, since I'm a specialist in architecture and architecture theory. Certainly, there are the new medias, as we know, the internet, smartphones, and so on. But there's also the old media, as I already pointed out here at the press conference. Among them stands out architecture, as it is definitively the oldest, to my knowledge, the oldest mass medium you can think of. Just take the medieval Gothic cathedral, or the Roman, Greek, or Egyptian temples. Not least the temples, for example, of Angkor Wat for Cambodia, or the temples in Java, these famous temples. Before there was scripture and before there were books, there was architecture as a mass medium. As I already referred to at the press conference a couple of days ago, this will kill this, the book will kill architecture. This is the famous quotation of Victor Hugo from his book Notre Dame de Paris. It is the main protagonist of the book, the abbot, who wants to convince his dialogue partner that the invention of the printing press would eventually lead to the end of architecture as a mass medium, as the book replaces architecture, as he believed. In retrospect, we know that the printing press did not kill or replace architecture, although it did change architecture, but in a way not foreseen by the abbot at that time in the Middle Ages, or not in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance. Today, by way of analogy, one might think that the internet is killing the book and once more architecture. There are some people out there at the beginning, especially of the internet age in the 1990s, who wanted us to believe that the digital technology will replace or kill book and architecture altogether. But the opposite is true. The more the digital technologies impose their rationality on the world, the more people appreciate material things. As a matter of fact, the digital and the material world are not mutually exclusive. Just like the printing press today, the internet and particularly social media do change architecture in various ways, but they do not replace architecture. As the Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan once held, new media never replace old technologies, but complement each other and eventually lead to a functional differentiation. Just like the book did not extinguish the horse, there are more horses than ever in the world, but there are also cars, and we use them appropriate to the way they function. So my two lectures will be about these changes in the status of architecture as a mass medium. In my first lecture, I will address architecture in its traditional way of communication through ornament. Ornament was and is, even today, essential for for the way architecture communicates. Hence, I will address the question of ornament, especially in the context of the ornament debates that sprang up in early modernism, that is in the early 20th century. The thesis is, whenever ornament debates come up, it is less a sign of the crisis of the ornament than of the crisis of culture at large. Debates on ornament are always signs of a crisis of culture. That is, ornament is at the center of the reconceptualization of the relationship between content, form, and its communication. What we can notice in early modernism is not so much the abolition of the ornament, but the change of status of the ornament and thus the way architecture communicates. So in my second lecture, I want to address the return of the ornament debates in architecture in the second half of the 20th century. As we will see, though, they don't return on the basis of classical rhetorics, as rhetorics is the basis for the technique of ornament, but they return in the context of the so-called linguistic turn of the 1960s on a scientific basis. We speak of a re-semioticization of architecture in the advent of postmodernism. Hence, in the second lecture, I will address the question of an architectural semiotics. I will talk about how architectural science are distinguished from linguistic science, and I will talk about how architectural science, it will be an introduction into a new approach to architectural semiotics. The title of the lecture is The Presence of Science Towards a Phenomenological Semiotics in Architecture. This is the title of the second lecture. Now let's start with the first lecture and the discussion of ornament as the prime means of communication in architecture. And I just want to point out, if you want to read this first lecture, it is in here. Not literally, I changed certain things, but this is a book I published about 2 years ago on the ornament debates. There are 3 texts of mine in here, and I think it's a good introduction into the question of communication in architecture via ornament. And you will find this maybe, I don't know, this will be a present to Rina afterwards. Okay, so how things talk or how things communicate. As you see, I changed the title because we will, in the second lecture, we will discuss the question whether architecture is a language or not. I would say it's not a language, and you cannot compare it to a language. This is why architecture does not talk, but it communicates. So, how things communicate, architecture, ornament, and visual communication. So, whenever ornament debates or debates over ornament break out in architecture, it is, as already pointed out, a sign of a crisis. Debates on ornament are always indicative of a crisis. The intention of this lecture is to show how it is revealed in the practice of ornament, what the reason for it are, and what it means for architecture. So debates over ornament are, however, by no means a sign of a crisis in architecture alone. Far beyond that field, they are a sign of a comprehensive, universal structural transformation which is experienced as a crisis of culture in general. These pictures illustrate a little bit what happened. So the distinguishing and stimulating characteristic of ornaments is that they are not just surface phenomena that can be experienced by the senses, but can also appeal to reason. Ornament debates reveal changes, shifts, and rejections of culture And often the general public becomes aware of these things, these changing things and concepts, solely as a result of the debates over the ornament. It is very important to understand ornaments are not aesthetic events that affect only style, beauty, and taste, but are rather symbols that reveal a culture in transformation. So they are conceptually interesting, not for their beauty or for their form. It is thus no coincidence that the question of ornament is particularly relevant and discussed again today. For some time now, digital media technologies have had a profound impact on cultural practices and have been rebuilding the cultural logic of the machine of the 20th century to suit their own requirements. In the modernist era, it was the transformation or transition from graph production by hand to machine production, which changed the fundamentals of culture and triggered the debates over ornament. Today, by contrast, it is the transition from analog machines to digital technologies that is shaking up culture again. And once again, the question of ornament is the focus. So the periodicity with which crises of ornament recur in the modern era would thus seem to suggest that the crisis of ornament must be seen as an expression of the modern era's own awareness of crisis. The modern era's susceptibility to crisis is revealed in the recurring crisis of ornament. It marks a turning point in European cultural history when, during the Enlightenment era, around the mid-18th century, ornament such as rocaille, allegory and arabesque became problematic. It could no longer be otherwise. Something had changed. They could no longer be justified by tradition and suddenly demanded theoretical reflection. With its reduced formal language and ornament, classicism therefore was the first provisional reaction to this, but it could not suppress the demand for further theoretical reflection. So debates over ornament have not ceased ever since. After the first crisis during the age of the Enlightenment, it was industrialization around the mid-19th century that triggered the question of the status of ornament. This was followed by the efforts of Art Nouveau to employ the organic ornaments to save the cult value of mass-produced commodities from the depersonalization of machine production. In the 1920s, there was a call to dispense with classical ornament with the goal of a fundamental renewal of culture in the machine age. Then in the 1960s, the introduction of computer technology led to a renewed debate over structural ornament, which was followed immediately by the experiments of postmodernism and later deconstructivism as well. They were attempting to reconnect to classical rhetoric and its ornaments, such as rocaille again, allegory and arabesque, to regain the language of architecture that had been lost with modernism's renunciation of ornament. The question is now, what is ornament, but also what is ornament today? Is it even possible to define it, given its diverse manifestations? Is it possible there has been a consistent core in the concept of ornament, despite the changes in architectural practice and style over the century? This raises the question of the relationship between general and specific qualities of the ornament. The question arises of a definition that would apply to all ornaments, yet be open enough to absorb their changing aspects. And this is a little bit the task of today, to define what is ornament, and define it in a way that it covers all ornament practice from the beginning, let's say, in architecture practice to today. So as you see here in these images here, now you see a kind of neo-Gothic building, high-rise building, the Woolworth building in New York. You see a modernist building. This is the Federal Center in Chicago, East Van der Way, and you see the latest high-rise building by the famous architect Frank Gehry, the Beacon Tower in New York, and you see again, there's again somehow ornamental, something ornamental coming back into architecture after its supposed abolition in high modernism, although I will refer back also to this building in the middle, and I will show you that there is also ornament implied, although at the moment you would not believe that it is so, but there is something ornamental in this building. Again, here are some details, and I will refer to this. So, of course, we know on the left-hand side is ornament, on the right-hand side we suppose that might be also has to do something with ornament, but in the middle it has also something to do with ornament. It is a modern ornament, although it might not look like this. We will talk about this, and I think once at the end of the lecture we will understand hopefully a little better what ornament is, how it can be defined, and so that we can describe all three architectural practices in terms of ornament. So this is the program for the first lecture here. Now we come to the preconceptions. So what then is ornament? Where does it come from, and what are the features by which it is recognized? As shown by the bewildering number of treatises and essays on the subject, these questions are surrounded by great uncertainty. This uncertainty, however, also arises, on the one hand, from the fact that the discussion of ornament, more than any other topic in aesthetics, has been rendered so thoroughly ideological in modernist and postmodernist discourse. And on the other hand, there's the fact that ornament too goes lost in the flood tide of digital images today, just like all the other kinds of images. For a better understanding of ornament, it is therefore necessary, first of all, to eliminate a number of preconceptions. So the first and most stubbornly repeated preconception is that the Viennese architect Adolf Loos declared that ornament is crime. Maybe you might have heard about this. Or tabled as a discussion of ornament as crime, and thereby established the coordinates for the modernist attitude to ornament, the modernist rejection of ornament. One speaks of ornament as having been liquidated by modernism. One speaks of the absence of ornament as a cultural value of modernism, and also of the drama of modernism resulting from the lack of ornament, a drama which only now in our current digital age would seem to have been overcome. But Loos' epoch-making essay, Ornament and Crime, found the model of its title in the work by Adolf Kreis, another writer, Viennese writer. Its book is Morality and Criminality, and so it's also the title. Adolf Loos never said ornament is crime, he always said ornament and crime, and this is his text about ornament and crime, but he never said this ornament in general is crime. So while in fact writing and, Loos had no intention of meaning is, of course. Furthermore, he by no means equated all ornaments with crime, and he made no attempt to forbid all ornament as a matter of principle. Loos wrote the following thing: everything created, and this is kind of his definition almost, everything created in past centuries can be copied today to the extent that it is still of use. Everything can be still copied today to the extent that it's still of use. the forms of the new phenomena that appear within our culture must be developed without conscious reference to styles which already have been superseded. Modification of old objects in order to adapt it to modern needs is not allowed. The rule here is either copy something or create something new. Either copy something or create something new. And as he further pointed out, no third possibility exists. What Laws opposed was the gratuitous invention of ornament. According to Laws, ornament cannot be invented. It somehow grows out of the process of culture, and I will show you this later. One can always copy ornaments, but you cannot invent them. Ornaments are not subjects to artistic invention, but they are the result of certain cultural processes. We will come back to this in a moment. And you see here one of these tables, this so-called elephant's trunk table. It's a copy of an old Egyptian original. I think it goes back 3,000 years or almost. And Adolf Loos made copies of this table because he thought this is a prototypical way to deal with the idea of table. Secondly, it is repeatedly maintained that modernism came into existence as a form of iconoclasm, and that the visible sign of the attitude is presumed to be found in the white, unadorned, puritanical structures of modern architecture, as seen, for example, in Stuttgart's Waisenhofsiedlung. To be sure, a fleeting glance might suggest that modern architecture would entirely have banished ornament and likewise images of all sorts of architecture. This counts, however, as a repeatedly revisited cliché, which has been heroically deployed in the postmodernist movement's promotion of itself in the battle for hegemony over images. The modernist movement's rejection of certain ornaments, and thus as well of certain iconic structures, is only one side of the coin. The other is modernist research for a new visual and symbolic language that was capable of doing justice to the ordered, changed social, technological, and material premises of its time. Also to this we will come back in a moment. The third preconceived idea of modernism is the often reiterated notion that the early modernist discussion of ornament was unique. That only the modernism, the protagonists of modernism discussed ornament. This too belongs to the realm of modern myth, along with the assertion that, as one scholar held, aside from a few memorable postmodern experiments, the language of ornament in architecture remained silent for decades. Yet a look at precisely the second half of the 20th century will attest the opposite, and namely to the fact that the permanent discussion of ornament, albeit with a different intensity, was underway, and that ornament indeed was a fuse that ignited the period's theoretical disputes. Also in the second half of the 20th century, it's again the ornament which ignites theoretical discussions. Historical analysis will show that ever since its alleged eradication, ornament has time and again been the catalyst of a reconceptualization of architecture. An example will be found in the exhibition, there was an exhibition in the 1960s, which called Ornament Without Ornament. It addressed the question of ornament within the context of what then were the current debates of structuralism. With the emergence of computer technology in the 1960s, for example, Frieder Nake, Georg Nees, Michael Noll, made ornament again a central concern of computer graphics, which in turn became the point of departure for concrete art. Postmodernism and deconstructivism also relied to a great extent on ornament, as we know, postmodernism, on the ironic use of classical ornament deconstructionism on the ornamental and performative aspects of the return to such classical rhetoric strategies, again of allegory, catachresis, synecdoche, and the grotesque, even if in both of these cases these procedures were seldom referred to as such. It can be shown that ornament has again and again reappeared in times of cultural change, but not in its classical forms, and by no means simply as a marginal phenomenon. It represents itself, quite to the contrary, at the center of theoretical discussion and even as its catalyst. So we can thus begin to shape a possible definition of ornament. The point of departure is that modernism rejected the older ornaments of various historical styles, especially the iconology of the 19th century, but not for the purpose for somehow getting rid of ornament. This was not the purpose. Architectural modernism's goal was rather to develop a language of its own, or its own canon of symbols and images, in the light of the novel premises of the altered cultural framework of the machine age. As they grappled with these issues at the beginning of the 20th century, the protagonists of early modernism rejected the ornaments of received tradition, but that doesn't permit the conclusion that they rejected ornament entirely. So the writings, for example, and now we are getting a little bit more concrete, this was a theoretical introduction. The writings of, for example, of some of the protagonists of modern architecture, like Henry van der Velde, some names, Hermann Mutesius, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, reveal a different picture, indeed. Their works almost magically revolve around a particular theme, the theme of a new architectural language in accord with the new social and technological phenomena of their era. Van der Velde, for example, writes, "The works of the engineers have covertly influenced our lives and habits. Since the modern age produces entirely new technology objects, it's only natural for them not to present themselves in garb that comes from the past, but in, I quote, forms which have never before been known. And ornament was unavoidably an integral component of this search for a new cultural architectural language that synchronized with current forms of cultural practice." Gottfried Semper remarks as early as 1869 in his book Über Baustile that the function of architecture, just as of the arts in general, is to accomplish, you can read it here, to accomplish the symbolic representation of the current social, political, and religious system, the current, and thus to link back to the basic concepts that underlie those systems. Van der Velde insisted on the need for logical connections, very important, on a logical connection between new ornament and new architectural practices. Accordingly, he spoke of rational ornament and argued that ornament must not be autonomous. Ornament, as he saw it, was no free artistic expression. It was no expression of an author's desire to make art. Ornament wasn't at all a self-justified act of creativity. Instead, it was this. He says, "Ornament is first of all a necessity. It's not only something applied at will. It arises from the object of which it remains connected. It refers to its purpose. Ornament becomes organic and refuses to be something only stuck on or applied to." The same laws that guide and this is, I think, very important, the same laws that guide the work of an engineer must guide the ornamentation that I see as equivalent to such technology. A new architecture demands a new body of ornamentation, but not as invention, but as something which grows out of the process of the making of architecture. So Van der Velde insisted that ornament be developed first of all from out of the particular conditions of the construction and production. Secondly, in the light of the logic of its materials. And thirdly, as a reflection of the function of the building it adorns. And this was his reason for his concept of rational ornament. Ornament is something connected to the way of production of the house. He saw ornament to be the element that gives external visibility to the often hidden logic of a building's materials, construction, and cultural function. So that so-called Van der Velde building in Weimar, for example, he therefore uses steel beams as window lintels. I can show this to you. This one here. And this one here. All these things are more traditional, still traditional ornaments. There's a socle, this is a traditional element, but the steel lintels, this is something which he introduced. You see the windows looking as if hanging from this steel beam, but this steel beam is not a steel beam which is structural, but it's only a visual steel beam, and behind this steel beam there's the real construction, but it is hidden from vision, because then the building you have to cover the wall with plaster to protect it from wind, from sun and so on, to make it weatherproof. But then he places another steel beam, as you can see here in front, and this is not a structural steel beam, it is a steel beam which just articulates something, brings something to visibility which is hidden behind, and the thing behind is a structural thing. So this is a modern ornament, it's a rational ornament in this case. So, in fact, the modernists pronounced no sweeping verdict against the ornament in general. It is also to be found in a paradoxical expression on the part of Walter Gropius, the founder and first director of the Staatliche Bauhaus in Weimar. And he says, let's go to this. Forward to tradition. Ornament is dead, long live ornament. So this is the modern dialectics. So modern ornament is dead, but it's the old ornament. We cannot invent ornaments, but long live ornament. This means ornaments have to be developed out of the new construction methods and the new concept of architecture, as you can see here in the two masters' villas in Weimar. We see a reflection here of an awareness that modernism marked a new beginning, and that the machine age counted as a renaissance, which first of all faced the task of creating its own language and its own tradition, inclusive of the canon of its exterior images and all of its ornamentation. So to create a new language and tradition of its own production modes. This is also to be seen in the words pronounced in 1926 by Mies van der Rohe, and he said, "The character of our age must be visible in our constructions by way of the means of our age, and not by way of means of past age." So if architectural form is to measure itself against whatever the current state of technological and cultural development and possibilities, it follows that the creation of ornament in the modern world can no longer find its coordinates only in classical historical perspective. Classical ornament is rejected, not ornament as such. Quite to the contrary, the modernist debates on ornament reveals time after time that its protagonists were concerned with defining the modern world and its shifting cultural forces precisely by way of what they purportedly so vehemently rejected by way of ornament. It is a major means of expression, of communication, also for the modern architects. Now we go back to the beginnings of architecture and see how they defined ornament. The making and nature of ornament. So, the early modernist architects had no interest in the general elimination of ornament as such, and instead were concerned with the culturally immanent logic of ornament and its further development in the modern world. Modernism was not intended to stand outside of history, but to the contrary, was committed to the task of returning architecture to its roots, and thus to its true origin and immediate cultural function. In order better to understand the fundamental structure of ornament, it therefore seems reasonable and pertinent to cast a glance back into history and to look at the question that the ancient Roman author Vitruvius, Marco Vitruvius Pollio, raised about ornament in his book De Architectura Libri Decem. It's the first book written on architecture ever. It's the first book, and written around 30 before Christ. It's the first theoretical treatise on architecture. Vitruvius indicated three sources of motivation of ornament, and they are not that far from what we understand of ornament today. On the example of the Corinthian capital, he discusses its cultural motivations. On the example of the Doric and Ionic columns, he speaks of its anthropological sources, and on the example of the metope and triglyph frieze, he examines its genetic origins. So Vitruvius first of all tells the story of the discovery of the Corinthian capital by the Greek architect Callimachus. So in his fourth book, we read the following story. It is related that the original discovery of its form of capital was as follows of the Corinthian capital. A free-born maiden of Corinth, just of marriageable age, was attacked by an illness and passed away, so she died. After her burial, her nurse collected a few little things which used to give the girl pleasure while she was alive, put them into a basket, carried it to the tomb, and laid it on top thereof, covering it with a roof tile so that the things might last longer in the open air. You see it here on the right-hand side. The baskets and some plate, stone plate to cover the basket. This basket happened to be placed just above the root of a plant, of an acanthus plant. The acanthus root pressed down, meanwhile, through it was, by the way, when springtime came round, put forth leaves and stalks in the middle, and the stalks growing up along the sides of the basket and pressed out of the corners of the tiles through the compulsion of its weight, were forced to bend into volutes at the outer edges. So it grows out this plant from below the basket, and then on the top it somehow bends around because there's this this stone plate. Callimachus, Callimachus, from the Athenians called katatechnos, he was called, so the artist, for the refinement and delicacy of his work with marble, just then passed by and recognized the symbolic power of the basket when the tender young acanthus leaves growing around it. So when he was strolling along on the side, all of a sudden he discovered, he saw this thing, and all of a sudden he discovered some sense in this piece. But what did Callimachus recognize in the basket overgrown by plants? What is its secret? How was it able to rise to such prominent status? So the art historian maybe I'll make it a little bit shorter here. There's a discussion about whether this is really a true story. Probably it is invented, because a country's plant is just wheat, it's no special plant. And the question is, how could a wheat become such a symbolic figure in architecture, since as it is not a really special plant. But this is not important as such. The important thing here is that Kallimakhos discovers a certain sense in this basket surrounded or overgrown by the acanthus, because he sees this as a symbol of life. We could say life maybe of the dialectics between nature and man-made things. But the interesting thing is, for him, the man-made thing is first, and then it gets somehow surrounded and overgrown by the acanthus plant. And then it becomes a kind of symbol for the perfect, how can I say, what's the word? Relation between nature and culture. But the important thing is that in his case, culture is first, and then nature comes in order to reconquer culture, and this makes the thing so valuable as a symbol of human culture. And it is interesting. I just want to shortcut a little bit my talk here. It is interesting that also Vitruvius presents a similar discourse with respect to the Doric and Ionian columns. A little bit different, although he, however, refers to nature and culture. His reference to nature and culture is supplanted by reference to the human body and its principle of male and female. Vitruvius tells that the Doric column came into existence as an analog to the male body and as a symbol of stark masculine power. The Ionian column, you see both of them here, the Ionian column, on the other hand, embodies the female principle and the slender female form. Its cannelures, this is the long stripes, vertical stripes, the cannelures are reminiscent of the pleats of a woman's garment, and the capitals volutes of a woman's locks of hair, whereas the emphasis of the shaft and the swelling of its bases give visual expression to the way the column functions as a carrier of weight. As you can see, these columns always are a little bit thicker in the middle, so they give the impression that a heavy weight is pressing on the column, and it somehow gets a little bit under tension through the weight which it carries. So, concerning the erection of the temple of Diana, for example, temple built in Ionian order, Vitruvius recounts the following story. Just as afterwards, when they desired to construct a temple to Diana, people in a new style of beauty, they translated these footprints in terms characteristic of the slenderness of women, and in the capital they replaced the volutes hanging down at the right and left like curly ringlets, while they brought the flutes down to the whole shaft, falling like the folds in the robes worn by matrons. This is about the cannelures, the vertical things, elements here. Vitruvius also gives a similar account of the temple of the Pan-Ionian Apollo, where the master builders had applied the proportions of the male body to the width and height of the column. So he remarks, thus the Doric order, as used in buildings, began to exhibit the proportions, strength, and beauty of the body of a man. And shortly afterwards, he says, thus, in the invention of the two different kinds of columns, they borrowed manly beauty, naked and unadorned, for the one, and for the other the delicacy, adornment, and proportions characteristic of women. So such formal analogies, still here, to the human body might lead one to speak of an anthropomorphic relationship. Here again, however, the column is first of all a technical artifact and an element of construction, as Vitruvius mentions not simply in passing. It's only at a second stage that character, feeling, atmosphere are summoned up through analogies to the human body. Such forms of ornaments are more properly referred to as anthropological rather than anthropomorphic. So Vitruvius, however, also points to a third origin of ornament. Now we have two origins. The one is the basket, which is overgrown by nature. The second one was the analogy column to the human body, male or female. And now we have a third origin. Ornament allows an architectural structure to link back in retrospect to its process of construction and its mode of existence as man-made artifact. Here he cites the temple of the Doric temples, Meto and triglyph frieze. You see it over here, the Meto. Sorry, here this Meto, triglyph. This is this frieze. Here it's a very characteristic order in temple architecture. So he recounts that the earliest temples were constructed of wood and that the beams of their roofs extended beyond the lateral walls, just as continues to be common still today in housing construction. And here you see an image of how the temple, the roof is constructed, and maybe you understand where the ornament comes from. So as time went by, he says, temples came no longer to be built in wood, but of much more noble and durable material of stone. In order not to lessen the sublimity of the appearance of construction in stone, those parts of the temple that continued to be made of wood, such as the roof construction, came to be concealed behind the stone facade. Yet the motifs of triglyphs and intertinia did not disappear, and instead were transformed into the meadow and triglyph frieze that run around the temple's circumferences. The figures of triglyphs and intertinia would found their rationale in the logic of construction, built of wood, were transformed into the two-dimensional structures of the stone frieze, as such as ornament. So Vitruvius remarks that starting from carpenter's work, artists in building temples of stone and marble imitated arrangements, believing that they must follow, imitated arrangements typical of construction in wood, believing that they must follow these inventions. End of quote. So you can see here, these ornaments, just like you see here, the ornaments of the triglyph and the metal frieze, it's not an invention. It's not about beauty. It is about construction. They tell something about the construction of the building, which was hidden once the temple was constructed in stone. Stone construction means that the certain construction details are hidden behind the facade, and the ornaments communicate something about the modes of construction. So this is about ornament as a means of communication. It communicates about how the building is made. Not only how the building is made literally, but also about the history of the coming about of the temple in its present state in stone, while it was before made in wood. So ornaments by no way are just inventions. They're always linked to the modes of the construction of the building, and they tell us something about the construction, about the past. So there are no inventions. And I think this is very important to understand, that already Vitruvius, in his first treatise on architecture, mentioned this fact that ornaments are not inventions. It's not about beauty in the first place. Of course, it's beauty. You can use it, for example, to insert this kind of reliefs or pictures which tell a second story, we could say, but in the first place it tells the story of the construction of the building. And I think this is very important to understand. Now we can also say, say that ornament derives from a logical relation to the building process and its symbolic content out of either naturalist, culturalist motivation. This was the story with the invention of the Corinthian capital with the basket and the plant covering it. The second one is an anthropological motivation. This is about the Ionian and the Doric order, where you make this comparison with the human body, either male or female. And then you have the third one. Sorry, I wrote 3 times 1. This is wrong. The third one, of course, it's a kind of genetic motivation. It's about the coming about of the building, telling the story of its construction. So I think this is very fundamental to understand ornaments. If you don't understand ornaments, if you don't understand this, you don't understand ornaments, and probably mix up ornaments with decoration. Decoration now we can define as those things which are just applied to make things nicer, supposedly nicer, while ornaments have something, stand in a rational logic to the building and communicate something about the building. So I have to look. So we come to the fourth part, and it will become more clear, I think, here, to the so-called double polarity of ornament. So in the mid-19th century, precisely this was the starting point of Gottfried Semper, a German architect, and his book Style in the Technical and Tectonic Arts or Practical Aesthetics. So Gottfried Semper wrote this book in reaction to a new change in technology in building construction, and he was again forced to rethink architectural theory and the relation between ornament and architecture. On the other hand, it was also a reaction, as I just said, it was a reaction to the new technology, to mechanical production and the impetus with which it was bringing about changes in society. This was the sense in which Semper was to write that style, as a word, as it can easily be replaced by ornament. Ornament then exists of the agreement of a work of art with the history of its creation, with all the preconditions and circumstances of its coming into existence. Like Vitruvius, Semper speaks of the logic of ornament and as well as of its communicative function. He says, from a stylistic point of view, the work of art presents itself not as an absolute, but as a result. It's a result of something, it's a result of a process. Semper was concerned with the immanent dynamics of ornament, with its origins in the architectural process of a building's construction. Semper's discussion of ornament appealed to a broader ethnological terms, largely in reaction to the First World's Fair held in London in 1851. On the one hand, Sir Joseph Paxton's architect, Crystal Colors, the glass exhibition pavilion was an overwhelming demonstration of the scope of the change that the new materials of steel and glass could bring into architecture. And on the other hand, the expo offered an overview of a wide variety of cultures from all around the world, thus inviting architects whose previous thinking had been entirely circumscribed by European and classical antiquity to more apply ethnological perspectives. As we see here, a new change happened in architecture, this time not from wood to stone, but from stone to steel and glass. This is why again ornament was discussed. So Semper's theory of ornament was to find its most famous examples in the Caribbean hut. So this is another another image of the Crystal Palace. As you can see, an enormous building. It was half a kilometer long, and this is a Caribbean hut. Its woven and braided walls were the basis on which Semper developed his so-called Bekleidungstheorie, the theory of dressing, clothing or covering. He saw weaving and braiding to be a basic principle of architecture. He says, ornamentation must derive from weaving and conform to it in terms of shape, color, and size. And it was on these terms that he spoke of cloth, albeit ambiguous relationship between clothing the body and the becladding of an architectural structure with ornaments derived from woven form. The focus is no longer Platonic and restricted to the quality of ornament as object. Instead, it assumes an Aristotelian breadth and includes the production of ornament and the process of its construction. The process behind the thing's construction and its nature as artifact. In reference to the making of cloth, Semper spoke of the making of the seam of the creation of structure, and of seams as points of departure of ornament. He says, the seam, you can read it here, the seam is a practical auxiliary device invented for the connection of homogeneous elements, homogeneous surfaces into a whole. As with the sewing of individual pelts of fur into larger pieces. Semper here found examples in the craft techniques of the Native Americans. And he got acquainted with these crafts in the World Exhibition. But there also came a point at which, he says, there came a point at which the Native Americans considered the function of seams as a connecting device no longer to be sufficient, and thus began to embellish them with complicated stitch work. So simple seams became rich decorations. Cross stitches turned into ornaments. Ornaments thus derive from the manner in which fabrics are made. And you see here some examples of Semper. So he said, once you stitch two pieces of fur together, first of all, it's a functional thing. It's a kind of constructional thing. So you put things together, you of course sewing, you do it in a certain way. But all of a sudden people started to make it more nicer. So out of this functional theme becomes an ornament. Turns out to become an ornament. So the interesting thing is that these ornaments, they are artifacts that do not conceal their making. They more or less present the making of the things. They insist upon it, attribute it value, and give it visibility. What would otherwise remain invisible, concealed beneath the surface, is brought into view. Semper concludes, whenever you can read it here, whenever human beings create decorations, they are simple, more or less consciously, giving clearer visibility to a law of nature that resides within the object being decorated. So there's a link, there's a rational link between ornament and the making of things. Ornament, therefore, would find its base in the laws of the procedures of manual craftsmanship. and then in the symbolic evaluation. Put differently, Semper sees ornament as the means for the translation of procedures of technical construction into symbolic imagery, available to both visual and sensory perception. He says, among primitive peoples of unspoiled feeling, like the American Indians, we everywhere discovered that the fundamental laws of style also find expression in their textile arts. Nothing is to be hidden. Those parts of the object which find a function in holding it together are always richly decorated. And it's still today, if you see this example, it works. So where you have to stitch together certain things, also these pieces become somehow a starting point for ornament. So simple theory of ornament still discovered its orientation entirely in the production of craft, in the procedures of craft production. He argued within the 19th century context of early modernism, but still was already aware of the crisis of that architecture faced. He knew that the new and different procedures of industrial production would change the conditions in which architecture operates, and thus as well its use of ornament. One of the triggers of such changes was, of course, Paxton's Crystal Palace, where the prefabrication, serialization, and standardization of the elements of construction had shaken the very foundation of the classical principles of architecture. Thus, simple style in the technical and tectonic arts is book, and the questions it poses for ornament are also to be seen as an expression of the crisis in architecture in this case. Ornament was the fuse, and not for the last time, that ignited the question of the reformulation of the basic theoretical principles of architecture. Semper's definition of ornament develops three themes. So we can now say the original basis of ornament lie in the procedures of manual craft production. It results from the nature of the object as artifact, no matter the specific procedures involved. Ornament bears the imprint of an immanent moment of historical consciousness. So secondly, the technical and material substance of ornament takes on additional value as a result of the additional work of the craftsman, as for instance with the accentuation of scenes. These additional elements of craft production allows the human being to appropriate at a different level the things that human beings create. And thirdly, Semper reveals that ornament has the function of mediating between procedures of craft production and the psychological, emotional, and ethical aspects of culture. Ornament has a double destination, we could say, or double definition. As an element of function as an element with functions of mediation, it stands between the construction in materials on the one hand, and symbol and anthropology on the other hand. It is almost like an interface between those procedures which result from the production and construction of the building, and on the other side, on the manual thing of doing of the artisan. So, this is here that the fundamental structure of ornament comes into view. What we can speak of as its double polarity. The process of the construction of ornament and the articulation of that process touched upon both of the valences of the architectural process. The level of construction in materials and the level of symbol and anthropology for both the craftsman and the architect. These levels or valences come together in ornament, which relates them to one to another. Semper had already identified them and speaks in his style of the so-called structural, symbolic level and the structuring technical dimension of the practice of architecture. An ornament is the interface where both meet. Referring back to Vitruvius, ornament can be described as the tertium comparationis between the different aspects of architecture, nature and culture, materials and the human being, as in the Ionic and the Doric order, the object and the history of its construction, and so forth. Ornament might be seen as the interface between the two sides of architecture, construction, materials, symbol, and anthropology. So, I think this just mentioned. Now we come to the last part. I make you an example of modern architecture. And this is about the memorial character of ornament. So in declaring that ornament articulates its process of construction and its nature as a man-made artifact, Semper gave formulation to one of the ornament's central features, even if he himself, in defense against the machine and its consequences of architecture, was thinking only in terms of classical craft production. Still, he stuck to craft production, not to industrial production. It was Otto Wagner, also a Viennese architect, who took the decisive step in the modernist discussion of ornament by extending Semper's definition of ornament, the definition that Semper had rooted in its understanding of craft production. So, to the new modes of production which the machine age had introduced. Wagner thus gave a modern orientation to the aspects of Semper's theory of ornament that concerned themselves with craft production and construction. So, in a book, Wagner writes, every new style emerged gradually from a former style as new construction, new materials, new human tasks, and new viewpoints demanded the modification or reinvention of already existent form. Wagner thus formulated the notion of an architecture in evolution, and he did not see the process to be limited only to the terms of shifting technological conditions. As well, great social upheavals have always given birth to new style. So the forces that contribute to effecting change in architecture aren't only a question of new technologies and materials, it is a question instead of the entire force field of the culture at large. Wagner thus concerned himself with both social, no less than with technological changes as triggers for change in architecture. With respect to the question of ornament, Wagner's interest was directed to the technical and material development of his time. In Modern Architecture, his famous book, he writes, every form of building, you can read it here, every form of building emerged from its construction and only later grew into an art form, And further, that the architect must always develop his art form from the process of construction. Art is linked to the production process. His constructions, however, no longer resulted from manual craftsmanship, but from industrial procedures as seen in his building of the Vienna Postsparkasse, the facade of which is an exemplary illustration of the transformation of utilitarian forms into an art form, with ornament as an element of its mediation. I can show you here very much as it's an exemplary. It's really a nice example to show how somehow the the technical form is turned into an art form. In this case, based on industrial production of architecture, not anymore on craftsmanship, as as in case of Gottfried Semper. So in general, the Postsparkasse building displays the classical elements of a palazzo. You can say this is a palazzo. An extended ground floor, various upper floors of regular size, and finally the attic decorated by allegorical figures. You see some of these allegorical figures up here. This has nothing to do with machine age, of course. It is still reminiscent to the past. But there's also some, the facade, however, is also distinguished by elements that resemble the rivets of a construction in steel. I put a circle here, sorry, it's the next image. Put a circle here, these very strange things, which looks as if the facade is made of steel, but it's not made of steel. But this impression is deceptive. Rather than plates of steel, these are thin sheets of natural quarried stone sheeting of so fine a caliber had never before been used for the facade of a building, and at the edges of the building they abut in such a way as to mark their thinness, make their thinness visible. Here in this case you see the edges here of the volume. You see how thin somehow these stone plates are. And this one was exceptional at the time. It was the first time that it was possible to make such a thing, to cut stone into such thin plates. So the rivets are likewise something other than what they seem to be. The rivets are not pieces that come out of the construction, of the steel construction, but they are part, and strangely, of the stone, the construction in stones. They are iron anchorings, and it's very interesting to see this facade. To make it short, these steel anchors or rivets or whatever you want to call it, they are pieces where in the construction of the facade you hang in the steel, the stone plates at first, and then behind there's plaster, and behind there's the wall. So the plaster, in the first moment, in the first hours or days, is not able to carry the stone plate. But while it dries, then the plaster realize a fixed connection between the stone plate and the wall. Then it's fixed, the stone plate is fixed to the wall. In this case, at this moment, you don't need these anchors anymore. So these anchors you need only during the construction time. You hang in these plates in order to fix them for the first hours or the first days, until the plaster dries and until there's a fixed connection between the facade, stone plates, and the wall. So it is interesting then that these anchors, at a certain point, they lose their function. First they were functional, then they lose their function. But they only remind us of the first function, and they remind us of the making of the facade. So it's almost a historical element. So they refer, it reminds us of the history of the making of the facade. So from a functional element, they turn almost naturally into ornaments, and they communicate us something now of the facade, although they themselves are not anymore functional. And this is a very nice example for the modern ornament, very much in line of the definition of ornament of Vitruvius and Semper, but now applied to the modern building techniques, the industrial production of such a facade. It's not anymore about the craftsmanship, it's now about the industrial production. So these bolts, these anchors, or whatever it is, these are, we can call them modern ornaments, because they have all the features of an ornament, but now turned into somehow, they have all the features of an ornament, but now applied to the industrial production of such a facade. And you see here, this is another building of Gottfried Semper. You see how thin these stone plates are, and what it means that you first have to fix it by these steel anchors, and then only in the second moment there's a fixed connection to the wall, to the structural wall, and then you don't need any more these elements, and then they turn into ornaments. And it's interesting here that these linear elements, of course, then they are applied to the facade. So here somehow Gottfried Semper's extends somehow his aesthetic, how can I say, his aesthetic tools, I can say, and turns still in reference to the bolts and the anchors. Then turns extends somehow his creative tools, and this becomes then kind of also an ornament. Also, you see here where the red circle is, you see the roof construction, and it's somehow similar, but only similar to the construction of roof in wood, but it's now it's now a roof in steel, which does not mimic a roof in wood, but it somehow carries on the principles of architecture now to the new construction techniques. And what we see here is part of the Crystal Palace in London, and you see here also certain kind of ornaments, but these are applied ornaments. They have nothing to do with the construction of this building. These are applied to it, so they are aesthetic decisions. These elements do not come out of the process of the production of the building. They do not highlight or explain the technology or how the building is made. So they are applied. We would say here, this is decoration and not ornament, because by now we understand that ornament is always somehow something which is connected to the making of the building and of the communication of the building, and as something which is in between, as a kind of interface between the technological and the anthropological condition of a building. So here Paxton did not understand maybe exactly what an ornament is, or he felt that he had somehow to decorate his building to make it look like a building in stone, so that it is accepted by the people. But then in the next stage, architects in the next or following generation, like Otto Wagner, they got rid of this and somehow based architecture anew and the question on the ornament, on the new construction, and also the social conditions, which we, although here, cannot talk about. And this is my last example. This is the example building by Mies van der Rohe, one probably the most famous protagonist of modern architecture, first in Germany, later in the United States. And this building is an ornamental building, if you believe it or not. It doesn't look really like ornamental. It does, maybe it looks a little bit like a dumb building with a steel frame and infill with bricks. You ask probably yourself, where is the ornament? Well, there are certain details in this building. There are ornaments, although we don't see it, or maybe it must be explained. This is also the problem maybe of this building, that it's too intellectual an ornament to be understood by the common man. So this is this corner solution, and it's very famous, this corner solution, because what you see is, or what you think you see a steel, supporting steel construction or structure, but it is not. As you see from this plan, I hope you can read this plan. So this piece is this piece is this, then you have the wall running, and it is stopped by this U-shaped steel truss here, on the other side too, and then you have this here, and this is the ornament, because what you see, it shows to the outside the steel construction, but it's not load bearing, but it pretends to be, but it pretends it rightly, because behind there is this steel beam or post, and this is actually the structural element of the building. Or the problem is that it has to be covered with concrete, because it has to be made fireproof. So in order, if there is a fire, so steel is a very weak element, you know, it gets hot and all of a sudden the building collapses. So it must be protected by some sort of material, and at that time it was made by concrete. So you do not see the real construction. It's covered behind the concrete. So, but Mies van der Rohe wanted to show the construction of the building. He wanted to explain how the building is made, because it's not only historically, but it's very important for us to understand the making of a building, at least partially, because it's also this trust in the building. On the other side, it's part of the aesthetic, appearance and pleasure of the building, to understand how it works, because it's man-made, it's not naturally. So we don't have to understand how the mountains are made. This is nature, it's just like this, but things which are man-made, so we want to understand the rationale behind. So Mies van der Rohe then invented this corner. He opened more or less the corner. He stopped the bricks from coming close to the corner, as in the lower part here, and in the upper part you see he introduced then this folded metal plate, which is not load bearing, but which is somehow telling about what is going on behind. This is exactly what also Vitruvius was talking about. It's exactly what Simper was talking about. It is a bit in the way, it's in the sense also what Otto Wagner was dealing with. So this is a modern ornament, although he would not formally, the first glance, you would not be able to tell that it's an ornament. And you see also, here in this case, this is the federal building. You see these steel trusses here. These steel trusses are not necessary for the facade. The facade could do without. So it is. The question is it an ornament? Is it just decoration? Yes, it is an ornament, because it tells you about the structure of the building behind. So they are not functional, more or less in the sense as the metal, the steel anchorings in Otto Wagner's buildings are not functional anymore, but they tell you something about the making, about the logic of the building. Also the corner solution, it's very similar to the solution at the alumni hall, the IIT. So this is, we can rightly say this is a modern ornament. So modernism is not at all abolishing ornament. It is redefining it is looking for the right way to communicate architecture. And this is the way how they did it. And this is the last, my last slide. So we have the Greek temple. Of course, there's a lot of other buildings in between. We have the federal building of Mies van der Rohe as a modern ornament and a modern way of communications in architecture, of communicating the rationale of a building. And then we have a very interesting project by a Japanese architect, Isosaki. This is a competition for the station in Florence in Italy. It was not won, this competition, so it won't be built. But the question would be here, is this an ornament in the digital age in architecture? I would say yes, because this structure is made according with the latest technology, with parametric design. This is why the shape of this the structure is able to change because it's optimized, and so it shows somehow, you know, how the power or the forces flow through the beam, and the forces, they change direction, they're concentrated, they're worse, and so on, and this structure more or less makes it visible of how the building, how the structure works. So we have three different types of ornaments, three different ways of communicating in architecture. And the main argument is that, especially in regard to ornament, the ornaments debates are not over, but they change shape. Conceptually they stay the same, or at least as I try to define the ornament, it's a definition which allows us to define ornament over the last, you know, of the last 5,000 years of architectural practice in a way that it somehow defines the core of the architectural and ornamental practice, and which allows us to explain also, to deal also with the new technologies in terms of communication in architecture. I hope that I was able to make myself understand, because it's a complicated subject. I know you are not architects, architecture students, but maybe the examples were able to help you to understand what the idea is about. It's about the idea of communication in architecture, and in the next lecture I will turn, I hope it won't be that abstract like this here, we turn to the semiotics, to another aspect of communication in architecture after the return of the ornament in the ornament debates of the 1960s, 70s in